My name is John Herbst. I'm the head of the Dinu Patricio Eurasia Center. And we have a real treat in store for you today. We're having a book talk with Agnia Grigos, who has just written Beyond Crimea, The New Russian Empire, a book that I read before it came out, and I can tell you it's wonderful. Agnia is, you never know from looking at her, is an old pro dealing with Russia and the area right around it. She's the author of 3 books besides Beyond Crimea. She's authored The Politics of Energy and Memory between the Baltic states and Russia. And she's the author of the forthcoming New Geopolitics of Gas. This book, Beyond Crimea, is important because it lays out in an easily accessible, readable fashion the systematization of the Kremlin's compatriot policy. And compatriot is the fancy word for not just ethnic Russians, but Russian speakers who may live in Russia or may not. And Moscow has assiduously created aspects of a policy that starts with information, starts with culture. It moves on to establishing contacts, to issuing passports to Russians and Russian speakers, people who identify with, you might say, the Russian language and the Russian cultural space. And they develop these contacts for political advantage, ultimately including aggression, as seen in Georgia and Ukraine, to meet Russian state interests. And so things that seem benign are not necessarily benign. And with that, I'll turn it over to Agnia to explain more.
Well, thank you, first of all, Ambassador Herbst and the Atlantic Council for having me, and the audience for coming. It's a real pleasure. And it's really, well, first, greatly rewarding after a long research project and a long writing project to finally have the product in my hands and on paper. And I think probably many in the audience have written their own books, so you can, you know the feeling. And really, I started this book, the idea for it came to me in 2014, the start of the year, so ahead of Crimea's annexation and ahead of the conflict in eastern Ukraine. But I was starting to observe the rhetoric coming out of Moscow. And the rhetoric was something along the lines that the change in the regime in Kiev, the Euromaidan movement, now somehow spells a potential threat to Russian speakers or Russian minorities in Crimea and eastern Ukraine. And the rhetoric went that, and therefore, you know, we must protect them, or they're asking for our protection, and so on. And at the time, I really thought, okay, well, this is déjà vu, and actually, I've seen this movie before. It reminded me a lot of the work I had done previously in relation to the Baltic states, in terms of Russia, some of Russia's soft power efforts there. It reminded me a lot of what had happened in Georgia in 2008, and a lot of the rhetoric there around protecting Russian citizens and Russian compatriots were the exact words of President at the time Medvedev and Prime Minister Putin. It reminded me going back to Transnistria, to the late 80s and early 90s, and the war fought there with Soviet troops, again, protecting the rights of Russian speakers in Transnistria. So when I embarked on this project, I hoped to look at what have been Russia's compatriot policies, how they have been systematized, how they differed across the different post-Soviet states, how they differed, let's say, in the Baltic states versus in Ukraine versus Georgia versus Central Asia versus Armenia, Belarus, and so on. And how these compatriot policies fit in with the broader goals of Russia's foreign policy, its foreign policy toolkit, and even its military tactics and ambitions. So my findings indeed were that Russia has pursued a highly consistent policy towards the so-called compatriots. There are striking similarities to how they were pursued in the 14 different post-Soviet republics. Surprising surprising findings and how they fit, how compatriot policies fit in other Russian policy toolkit like soft power, information warfare, passportization, and so on. So before I go in a little bit into my findings, just so we're on the same page, I'll define just a little bit and discuss what are these compatriots. So as Ambassador Herbst mentioned, they can be ethnic Russians residing abroad. And this would number about 25 million people outside the Russian Federation. But this is far from the definition that the Russian government has used. And in fact, they have produced over the last 20 years more than 20 documents, policies, programs, and so on that deal with the Russian compatriots, how to treat them, how to use them as part of foreign policy, and so on. So in the most narrow sense, again, they could be just ethnic Russians. They could be Russian speakers. Now, what does that mean? It's essentially in groups of individuals who use Russian habitually in their day-to-day life. And they don't have to be, and are often not necessarily just ethnic Russians. They can be, for example, ethnic Ukrainians in Odessa that predominantly use Russian in their day-to-day life. They can be the Gagauz in Moldova that have their own Gagauzian language, but often day-to-day they end up using Russian. So these are, again, also Russian compatriots, and they number about 30 million people taken together with the ethnic Russians and the Russian speakers. Even more broadly, Russia looks at Russian compatriots, and they view them as part of what they call the Russian world. So these individuals that the Ruski Mir Foundation, for example, counts as totaling about 35 million people. They can be of various ethnicities, but essentially they have to have some sort of cultural, historical, even spiritual connection to Russia, the Russian Empire, and the Soviet Union. So essentially that could involve almost 185 nationalities of people who have historically lived on the territory of the Russian Empire or in the current the Russian Federation. So these compatriots have become a political concept and almost a legal category. And efforts to use them for foreign policy ambitions, and particularly for Russia's territorial ambitions, are most effective when three conditions are present. So essentially when there is this concentrated and significant population of so-called Russian compatriots. Two, when they reside on the border with the Russian Federation. And three, when they are perceived receptive to Russia's influence. So when these conditions are present, Russian compatriots can really become a tool, I found, of Russia's territorial expansion. And in the book, I model essentially what I call a 7-stage reimperialization trajectory. So it's, I'm a academic by background, so I have to have terms like the reimperialization trajectory. But essentially what it means is that, and the trajectory follows that there's softer policies of Russia's influence, and they progressively escalate towards harder and more aggressive policies. So they start with soft power, and this is really an attempt to use linguistic, cultural, and religious organizations and appeals to Russian compatriots, or these broad individuals that we discussed abroad. The Ruski Mir, or the Russian World Foundation, is a big player here in terms of providing linguistic training and cultural support and so on. The Russian Orthodox Church is another very important player, especially under the leadership of Patriarch Kirill, who has been highly influential in promoting this concept of the Russian world. And the Russian Orthodox Church counts 150 million people as members. It's highly influential in most of the post-Soviet states. So this is the first stage, soft power efforts. The second stage is humanitarian policies. And humanitarian policies, oftentimes in the case of Russia, well, or almost exclusively, they deal with trying to support the rights of ethnic Russians and Russian speakers in foreign states, specifically in the post-Soviet states. Their efforts also in escalating, oftentimes trumped up and completely fabricated human rights violations. Their efforts to use international organizations for these means. The Russian government also creates their own organizations to try to study these human rights violations and so on. There is some humanitarian aid. For example, interestingly, in Transnistria, at least in 2008, the Russian government was paying pensions to Russian citizens in Transnistria, so a type of aid. Sometimes peacekeeping operations can be involved in this stage as well. The third stage is, and really also these stages they're all somewhat intertwined, and they can vary in their sequence. They can occur simultaneously. But the third stage is compatriot policies, and really when institutions are being used to engage these Russian minorities or Russian speakers abroad. And these include Russian federal agencies for the purposes. They include government programs run by the city of Moscow, especially under former Mayor Lushkov. They include various foundations, the Ruski Mir Foundation, the Ruski Dom, the Russia House organization. It includes the World Congress of Russian Compatriots, which is held every 3 years, as well as some support for transnational groups like the Cossacks. And this is interesting because, I mean, you may recall that in eastern Ukraine, the Cossacks in 2014 had created their own short-lived Cossacks People's Republic before it was absorbed into the Luhansk People's Republic. So this is the compatriot policy stage, really trying to engage these minorities into organizations and trying to get them active politically. There's also some military training involved, paramilitary camps for the youth, Russian-speaking youth of the post-Soviet space that participate in camps called Soyuz. So moving forward after compatriot policies, the next step, and I think actually the most important step, or one that has really been understudied and its full significance maybe not recognized, is passportization. Now, and what I call passportization is a rather systemic effort to hand out Russian passports and Russian citizenship to groups of people residing outside of Russia's borders, and thus turn them from just simply compatriots, a rather fuzzy legal category, into Russian citizens. Now, and doing it systemically in specific territories. If you look back in the early 2000s and even the 90s in South Ossetia and Abkhazia, there was really a concentrated effort to hand out Russian passports. In Crimea, well ahead of Crimea's annexation, in fact, after the Orange Revolution of 2004, there was, again, a concerted effort on the consuls in Crimea to hand out these passports and so on. So this is a real turning point, turning, again, just simply these compatriots into Russian citizens. And why is this important? Because Russian government policies, their foreign policy, national security policy, and many others have always been quite explicit about the protection of Russia's citizens abroad. In terms of compatriots, it's been fuzzy, but actually that has also evolved. Over the last 5 years, a lot of Russian government documents have been increasingly more explicit about protecting not just Russian citizens, but also Russian compatriots abroad. So coming to the next step, so now once you have Russian compatriots and Russian citizens in certain territories abroad, now you move on to the information warfare stage, which is essentially aggressive propaganda to try to either sow ethnic discord in neighboring states, or to try again highlight these issues of human rights violations or various sorts of discriminations against the so-called Russian compatriots, Russians and Russian speakers. With part of that campaign, also try to raise this urgent need for their protection. And then really comes the next stage, stage 6, which is protection, when you go beyond rhetorical protection or calls for protection to starting discussing their military protection. And the final stage is, can be or could be annexation. Again, annexation is not necessarily a final outcome and not necessarily a necessary outcome. It's one option. In the end, we've seen instead, only in Crimea, we've seen annexation. We've seen frozen conflicts emerge instead in South Ossetia, Abkhazia, Transnistria, and so on. But nonetheless, even these frozen conflicts serve as an end to the means for the Russian government, because they create, lack of territorial integrity for these states. It really dampens their future efforts to join the European Union or NATO if they have, territorial instability and such problems or civil conflict. So this is I'll try to be brief. I won't go into much into the case studies on each of the different countries. You can read that in the book if of interest. So I'll turn it over.
Thank you. Agata, thank you for that presentation. In your book, you do a very good job describing the move from one stage to another, for example, in Georgia, for example, in Transnistria. I think your book is important because it tells people, and hopefully policymakers, that this is a pattern which in fact could be reproduced, so we can take steps to stop it. So, having said that, I noticed you talked about the 3 conditions which make it successful, this Kremlin tactic successful: concentrated population, on a border with Russia, receptive to Russian influence. 2 of those 3 certainly apply in Estonia and Latvia and Kazakhstan.
Absolutely.
Tell us how you see this playing out in those 3 countries.
Okay. Well, to start first with Estonia and Latvia. So certainly there's a concentration of so-called Russian compatriots, again, Russian speakers and ethnic Russians, both in Estonia's eastern region, in Idavaru County in Narva. There, and I would say probably in Estonia, the situation is most concerning, because I would say that the trajectory has moved furthest along. They have been most successful in achieving passportization in Narva. Currently in Narva, about more than 30%, about 36% of the Narva population currently has Russian citizenship. So this is pretty concerning. I mean, the numbers are pretty small. It's a small town. So there are about, let's say, roughly 20,000 individuals that hold Russian citizenship. But now if you look at South Ossetia, if we remember back, I mean, that was just 50,000 people. So maybe large numbers are not so necessary. However, certainly, now contrasting this with Latvia, though Latvia doesn't have passportization that has been so successful as in Estonia's Narva city, it does indeed have the largest population of the 3 Baltic states of ethnic Russians, concentrated in Latgale, which is a region that borders the Russian Federation. So there, in some cities and regions, almost 97% of the population are Russian speakers. Again, not necessarily ethnic Russians. Some of them are from mixed ethnic backgrounds, Polish, Ukrainian, and so on, but they have adopted to Russian as their primary language. So these countries, one, the high level of passportization, and the large numbers of individuals in Latvia raise concern. Now, it's also important to realize just simply the presence of Russian speakers in a country doesn't mean that they are necessarily receptive to Russia's influence. And I think in the Baltic states, we really see that that contrast between different generations. So the younger generation in the Baltic states of Russian speakers are generally highly integrated in their societies. They speak the local language. They have their citizenship, their local citizenships, and so on. Versus the older generation, sometimes that is not the case. Of course, what sets the Baltic states apart, as we know, it's their EU and NATO membership, and particularly Article 5, that gives them different type of protection, let's say, than to countries like Ukraine and Georgia. So when it comes to the Baltic states, I would be surprised to see a type of open military aggression from the case of Russia. But it doesn't mean that they will not try to exploit some of these, some individuals that they have there, some of their soft power policies, information warfare campaigns, and so on. Now, in contrast, in Kazakhstan, which shares a long, vast border with the Russian Federation, and in the north has, you could argue, somewhat disgruntled Russian and Russian-speaking groups. This is probably an area where you really could see potential moves, territorial moves. At the same time, up until now, the nature of the Kazakh regime, the autocratic nature of the regime, has actually allowed it to be rather successful in kind of stamping out and drawing red lines against Russia's more aggressive policies. So Kazakhstan really drew a red line against passportization. It's illegal. Back even in 1993, Nazarbayev made an excellent quote. I have it in the book where he says, already back in 1993, he said, whenever people start talking about, protecting the Russian, the Russian minorities abroad, I start really getting worried for them. It reminds me of, Sudetenland and so on. So, Kazakhstan doesn't have rose-colored glasses on in relation to these issues, and I think they're trying to, monitor the situation.
Thank you. Questions?
My name is Karol Schulz. I'm visiting research fellow at American University. And I wanted to ask specifically about your opinion. How would you imagine a successful containment of aggressive Russian imperialism, especially in Europe? And I would like you, if you may focus on the European Union, what should we do to prevent such developments like in Ukraine or Georgia? Thank you.
Well, I think first comes the realization that, first of all, some of the Russia's softer, what we perceive as softer methods really matter. Soft power, propaganda, influence in the media. And because those tools often set the groundwork for further more aggressive policies. So I think the first step is really having that realization and trying to address those. I think to some extent there was an assumption that, with the end of the Cold War, these were really problems of the past. There was also assumption that, when Central and Eastern European states entered the EU and NATO, this was also a problem that was solved. Same for the Baltic states. But we see that is not the case. Even after EU and NATO membership, Russia still pursues these types of policies of influence, coercion, efforts at subversion, efforts at trying to sow ethnic strife within the countries. So I think that is the first step. And then, of course, when it comes to being militarily prepared and ready, I think we've seen changes already this year from the administration and from the Pentagon that clearly named Russia as a national security threat, that quadrupled the European defense budget. But I think in addition to just these hard and military approaches, we need some of that softer responses as well.
Hi, good afternoon. Justin Tomchuk, U.S.-Ukraine Foundation. Why is it that Crimea and Kaliningrad are federalized, whereas Transnistria, Abkhazia, and South Ossetia are not? Thank you. It's
a very good question. And indeed, indeed, it shows the difference in how Russia has, let's say, finalized the solution in these different territories. Indeed, Crimea is the only territory that it incorporated. Transnistria, when it declared independence in 1990, and Russia has still not even recognized their independence officially. Part of maybe, let's say, what the case with Transnistria could be the difficulty because it doesn't, well, but on the other hand, like Kaliningrad, it's not continuous with the Russian Federation. Other states separated. In the case of South Ossetia and Abkhazia, though Russia recognized their independence, it has not incorporated them. Indeed, over the last year or two, we've seen these territories actually actively try to seek greater integration into the Russian Federation. And I think some of this, that's the real threat, even if something starts out as a separatist movement, some sort of ethnic conflict, and it turns into a frozen conflict zone. If this frozen conflict zone, like South Ossetia or Abkhazia, are not recognized by the international community, these territories end up living, in a kind of a gray zone, and then they essentially have no alternatives, even if maybe some individuals in South Ossetia were really, Ossetian nationalists and so on, but really they have no alternatives. Then they're living in this gray zone, and they eventually try seeking greater integration in the Russian Federation. But why not? Maybe Russia doesn't need it. I mean, it already has achieved many of its aims. It's already destabilized those countries. It already has de facto control over those territories. So trying to officially incorporate them might be just bad PR for Russia, and maybe it's just not worth it.
The non-federalized areas are not nearly as important to Moscow as either Crimea or Kaliningrad. Kaliningrad is important for, among other things, military reasons, and Crimea for a host of reasons relating both to Ukraine and to Russia.
Hello, I very much liked your seven-step program to explain Russian foreign policy, but I wonder, can you extend it to Syria, what Russia is doing in Syria?
It's a very good question, and of course, I wrote the book in 2014 and 2015 and early 2015. So, but I think what is interesting for me, again, is watching some of that rhetoric. And I see some similarities in the rhetoric coming out of Kremlin today in relation to Syria, where it's being positioned as a type of effort to protect Orthodox Christians. So essentially that Russia's campaign in Syria is an effort to protect Orthodox Christians and these civilizations. That to me is very interesting. It's a departure, because before a lot of this rhetoric was used solely in relation to post-Soviet countries. Now extending it beyond is a change. Also, Patriarch Kirill, he also very vocally himself, mentioned that this is part of, Russia's civilizational efforts, the campaign in Syria. Another interesting twist, I think, if we watch Germany today and some of the information warfare campaigns that Russia has had against essentially that. The German government is not protecting the Russian minorities in Germany, particularly in relation to some alleged incidents with refugees. So again, that type of rhetoric that's somewhat similar and very surprising.
John Sitalides with Trilogy Advisors. I'd like to come back to the Kaliningrad issue. You mentioned before that it is not contiguous to Russia. In fact, it's sovereign Russian territory surrounded by NATO, and specifically Poland, as well as Lithuania. So there are historic ethnic tensions between Polish and Lithuanian peoples along the Polish-Lithuanian border. Is there a plausible scenario where Russia would be concerned about the possibility of ethnic tension spilling over and affecting the interests of Russian citizens in militarized sovereign territory in Kaliningrad?
I think you read my piece for the Atlantic Council. I wrote a little bit about this issue. Indeed, it's interesting that, the territory, well, first of all, I mean, what you call the military strategists have called the Suwalki Gap is a particular territory between in Poland, that separates Kaliningrad, Russian territory, and Belarus, which is a very close Russian ally. Their militaries are highly coordinated, and so on. So this particular territory in Suwalki is not only just a literally kind of a short gap that the Russian military could potentially cross and try to create a corridor into Kaliningrad from Belarus, but that particular territory historically has had tensions between Lithuania and Poland over the issue of minorities there. Again, this is not an issue where I see being immediately explosive. Again, it's more of a historical issue. But I think looking at Russia's past track record in trying to exploit various ethnic tensions, to try to manufacture them even when they don't exist, I think this is one issue area to watch.
Paul Schwartz, CSIS. One of the things we saw in eastern Crimea was that Russia actually overestimated the receptivity of the population and may have overreached in regard to that. I'm curious if you've seen any lessons learned on the part of the Russians, either to prevent that kind of overestimate in the future, or lessons learned to make their efforts to subvert the population, if you will, a little more effective going forward.
Well, I think it's indeed a very accurate observation, and maybe one I didn't even fully express, or a point I didn't fully make. But just the fact that some individuals in some parts of post-Soviet space speak Russian, or even are ethnic Russians, it doesn't necessarily mean that they identify with the Russian cause. In fact, in the course of my book, I interviewed about 100 people focusing on the younger generation, really to gauge their perceptions. And you could see that really their ethnicity or their language often didn't have much to do and didn't determine necessarily their foreign policy views or their support towards Russia. And in fact, quite the opposite. After the war in eastern Ukraine, many of them have become much more cautious and hesitant about Russia's intentions. And vocally they say they don't want to participate in the so-called Russia's compatriot political project. They don't want to have anything to do with it. I think in the case of eastern Ukraine, there were many interesting things that happened there. First of all, in my book, I show some evidence that already in the 2000s, so after the Orange Revolution of 2004, Russia was training and providing funding to some separatist militant groups in the Donbass. So they were trying to already create that at least loyal minority who would support their interests. But I don't think there was ever any evidence that the vast majority of people in Luhansk or Donetsk wanted Russia's protection, wanted Russia's involvement, wanted separatism or anything of that nature.
Okay. Thank you. I'm George Pselishvili, Carnegie Visiting Scholar in Georgetown University. So in the first place, thank you for the presentation. And I have to admit, I'm really looking forward to reading your book, particularly when you mentioned kind of the role of religion. Well, myself as a Georgian citizen, I can see that this is the weakest spot in Georgia, because kind of the fact that like Georgia and Russia share the Orthodoxy, this is the strongest actually kind of the point of Russian influence on Georgia at the moment. So I wish actually kind of sometimes many of my citizens kind of become disabused of this influence. So when it comes to kind of the further potential Russian expansion and the policies, so do you think that the current weakness in European Union, economic woes and kind of the political, kind of the self-searching, gives the Russian additional window of opportunity, particularly in countries like Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, not necessarily in terms of military aggression, but in terms of declining European appeal and make these countries actually kind of more just oriented like towards Russia. And the second, what is kind of the perception within Russia? So the Ukrainian adventure after Crimea, kind of Donbass, Luhansk, okay, put a very strong, big dent on Russian big trouble because of that. So is there any awakening in the Russian population? Thank you.
Growing in importance. In Georgia, as elsewhere in Europe, I think Russia is trying to create this new narrative. This narrative that Russia, in fact, is the protector of traditional Christian values. So not just the Orthodox Church and so on, but traditional Christian values. And that's why Russia has been somewhat successful or finding common dialogue with the far right and the extremist parties of Europe, finding common dialogue oftentimes with various extreme nationalist groups and so on. So I think, again, this is a dangerous and worrying trend. Certainly Europe is currently in a difficult situation with many problems inside its borders and outside its borders. In terms of the second question is, have the costs really, is Russia really feeling the cost and is the population reacting? I think in terms of the regime of Vladimir Putin, I think he, at least at this point, doesn't really care that much about the costs. It's part of his project of staying in power, and part of it is appealing to the more nationalist sentiments of the population in this idea of making Russia great, making Russia a superpower, and all of those issues. Certainly, the economic costs are adding up. And this has been really a product of two factors, both the sanctions and the low global oil and gas prices, which really hurt Russia's bottom line. But I think, it's not going to give up on its project or ambitions easily. I think we need more years here.
Here.
My name is Yaroslav Martinyuk, formerly with Radio Liberty. Assuming Russians' provocations and perhaps even the testing of Article 5 in the Baltics, short of military reaction by the West, what are the chances of increasing the sanctions in form, for example, of banning Russia from the interbank system, or denying visa privileges to all Duma members and their families, denying Aeroflot landing rights, and if need be, freezing Russian assets, confiscating their bank accounts. What are the chances of this ever happening?
To consider that today already, or even by mid-2015, many European powers were already looking to going back to business as usual with Russia. So I think it's really about having that political will. The only place where I can see it being led from is the United States, at least at this point, or the most vulnerable Central and Eastern European countries that are clearly concerned about their security. I think these are all potential, potential great options and great policy proposals, but will there be the political will to do so?
I've been following this very closely, and barring some major new Russian provocation, and it would have to be something beyond the types of provocations we see in the Baltic states, like the seizure of the Estonian counterintelligence official or the seizure of the Lithuanian ship, but something major, the chances of some substantial new sanctions are very slim. I think there's a good chance, but not a certainty, that the current sanctions, which are substantial, will be renewed. But something more is highly unlikely in the current environment. Okay, right here, I promised. And then all the way in the back after.
Thank you. Dieter Detke, Georgetown University. Based on your findings, how would you characterize Russian foreign policy? More along the lines of an expansionist power, and we have to be ready to contain and even reduce and try to suppress that type of expansionism, Or is Russian foreign policy more along the lines of the Monroe Doctrine, let's put it that way, which would open up much more of a accommodation, if you want to, from our side? How do you see the emphasis, the small emphasis between the two models of Russian foreign policy? Thank you.
Well, in my book, I argued that Russia is a re-imperializing power. So essentially, it's a power that's trying to maintain or reestablish its empire. So trying to maintain and regain influence where it has lost it in its peripheral countries, or trying to regain territories when there are opportune moments for doing so. So
I would like to add one more point on this. I don't think that in general terms, the international community would accept as legitimate the Monroe Doctrine as practiced by the United States in the late 19th century. And in fact, what we've seen is the international community celebrate Obama's outreach to Cuba. And what Russia's doing in its neighborhood might be meant principally for its neighborhood, but in the 21st century, I don't think that most of, certainly the Western world, is prepared to let Mr. Putin decide the future of the Georgian people, the Ukrainian people, the people of Moldova, and of course not the Baltic peoples. Okay, all the way in the back.
Thank you. My name is David Nikoradze. I represent Georgian television station Rustavito in Washington, D.C. Georgia didn't receive membership action plan at the NATO summit in Bucharest, but NATO leaders promised that one day Georgia will be a member of NATO. How big obstacles are Abkhazia and South Ossetia for Georgia to make some steps forward? And my next question will be about Georgia-EU relations. As you know, European Commission is abolishing visas for Georgian citizens. Do you believe that there will be some, I don't want to say provocation, but some attempts from Moscow to affect this process? Thank you.
Well,
if you don't feel comfortable.
no, in terms of, they had two questions there. Generally, I've seen consistently that when countries, in my research, when countries have tried to turn towards more, Western policies, more agreements with the EU and so on, Russia stepped up its aggressive campaigns. Now, in the case of Georgia and visa agreements, I'm not sure if that would be sufficient. Currently, though, Russia has stepped up its soft power efforts, information warfare campaigns. There's been a lot of, as you probably well know, there's been a lot of, various NGOs and movements and protests in Georgia, among those that say they favor the, closer relations with the Eurasian Economic Union, which is led by Russia rather than the EU. There's been some evidence of funding of those organizations by the, by Russian funds. So I think we may see more of this. I think I'm not sure about the first part of the question. The first part of the question, I don't remember. To what extent South Ossetia and Abkhazia will be an impediment to that? That's a difficult question. Maybe you can.
I would say that there's no indication whatsoever that NATO at the present time, and I would say for the foreseeable future, is willing to consider a map for Georgia. I don't rule out that at some point, 7, 8, 10 years or beyond, that might change. But at the moment, that's where NATO is. And certainly, Southern Ossetia and Abkhazia are one of the reasons for that, but not the only one. Okay.
Thank you very much. Paul Joyle, NSI. Back in the 1990s, we had a dramatic document produced by the House Intelligence Committee called Soviet Active Measures. And it went through a remarkable set of documents, including testimony by John McMahon, who was deputy director of the CIA. And the scope and size of the Soviet active measure program really was breathtaking. It was, back in those days, over $2 billion spent. And if you take that number and add what Oleg Kalugin said in his book, the former chief of KGB counterintelligence, that subversion is the heart and soul of the KGB, what you have described is part of an active measure program or influence program directed at subversion of a particular a target. Do you have any sense of what the budgetary resources are for this program?
You know, I will say, you know, absolutely, excellent question, excellent comment. I feel in many ways I'm scratching the surface in this book. But interestingly, this is, you know, probably the sole book, at least, that I know of that tackles this question. These programs are all intermeshed, as I tried to say, and it's very difficult to fully determine the funding because the funding goes, just for example, even, and I list some of this in the book. You know, you take a single year to, you know, and just funding for, you know, compatriot programs. It goes from the Ministry of Education, the Ministry of Culture, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, from Moscow's mayor's office, from various foundations, and on and on and on. So the policies, again, some of them are directed, some of them are humanitarian, some are the compatriots, some of them are related to language training, some of them are related to propaganda, information, and so on. But you have to see they're all intermeshed, and they're all seemingly pushing for the same aims. So I think further study is required here. I haven't tabulated the numbers, no, but I've tabulated the policies. So if you're interested specifically in the documents, there's a chapter in the book on that. It lists more than 20 documents, policies, acts, and so on, specifically on the question of compatriots from the early 90s to present day.
Right here. You talked quite a bit about the Orthodox Church and its role in all of this. When you go to the southern border of the Soviet Union, of Russia, you find all the Islamic areas or former members of the Soviet Union. How complicated does this become, or how does this fit into your general narrative?
Well, I think some of this poses problems for Russia because this effort to, well, the current Russian kind of conceptualization of the Russian people based on an ethnic rather than a civic definition, I think may pose problems for Russia itself because, of course, Russia itself has a significant populations that are, you know, they're not ethnic Russians and they're not members of the Orthodox Church, they're Muslim and so on. So I think, you know, the sword, you know, is a double-edged sword, as you can say. In the case of Central Asia, it's interesting to see also because, you know, these are, you know, nominally Muslim countries. But even there, the Russian church often has a significant presence, as particularly in Kazakhstan. So it's a mix, depending on the country.
Alexei Sobchenko, so far, this is the segue to the previous question. So far, Russia was very successful in using Russian-speaking minorities in the countries which were trying to lean toward West, Georgia, Ukraine, Moldova. However, it never, ever tried to raise the issue of oppressed Russian minorities in Central Asia, like, for example, in Turkmenistan, where the situation is really blatant. My question is the following. Given the fact that Kazakhstan is basically a mirror of Russia in terms of it lives on oil prices, and Kazakhstan right now goes through more or less through the same process Russia does, except we don't speak about this so much. We can expect that in Kazakhstan eventually there's going to be some, let's say, problem. And the obvious scapegoat would be Russian-speaking minority. In case Russian-speaking minority acts up, what is your prediction? How would Putin react? Would he support them or would he ignore them because Kazakhstan is actually quite a convenient neighbor? Thank you.
It's a good question, and in the first part of your comment, indeed, the way Russia has used compatriot policies has been rather cynical. It's not that Russia really went out and tried to support, the so-called Russian speakers, Russian compatriots, where they were really experiencing problems, as you particularly note in Turkmenistan. In fact, quite the oppositely, there, when Russia was doing a gas deal with Ashgabat, it was kind of a deal that they agreed, okay, we'll ignore the issue with the Russian speakers, and let's just do this gas deal. And instead it tries to drum up and fabricate these sorts of Russian human rights violations in other countries where they don't really seem to have any problems. In the case of Central Asian countries and Kazakhstan, I think a lot depends on the regime and potential regime changes in the region. Currently, the leadership, it's aging leadership, has been in power for a long time. A number of them are, in their 70s. So at the time, this current leadership, I think, has been, and I say in the book, they have been rather successful because of the great power they hold over society in thwarting some of Russia's more aggressive policies in terms of passportization. Some countries just forbid compatriot organizations like Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and so on. Now, if the countries start turning more liberal, I think there could be more Russian engagement. I think if the regime change creates some sort of internal conflict, again, there could be potential for more Russian interference and trying to stoke more the ethnic conflicts there and with the Russian minorities. But at least for the time being, I think Nazarbayev has a pretty good grip on the situation in northern Kazakhstan with the Russian minorities there.
Franklin Holcomb, the Institute for the Study of War. Outside of Ukraine itself, how has Russia's project there been perceived in the post-Soviet space, and has Russia learned any lessons that it could use to further its goals in the rest of the post-Soviet space from its projects and failures in Ukraine?
Well, I think first with some of these policies, again, it's important to recognize that Russia is not trying to co-opt 100% of the Russian speakers and the Russian minority. I think at the end of the day, it has been successful in just trying to co-opt a small percentage of the more radical members. They've provided them with funding, military training, and so on. And I think based on those, narrow targeted efforts, they have been, rather successful. So in some regards, even the perceptions don't matter so much because it's not really a genuine effort to win over win over all the Russian speakers and the Russian compatriots. In terms of some of the lessons, I think the lessons that, low cost, high return strategy has been rather successful for Russia. Certainly maybe in eastern Ukraine, perhaps, the anticipation was that, they could have moved further into eastern Ukraine, that more Russian speakers would have been more receptive, or that the Ukrainian army would have been less able to counter some of those military activities. But overall, I think it's been a rather successful campaign. Of course, again, it also has its limits because it's based something on coercion, shadow war, and so on. It's not a genuine movement, or it doesn't genuinely appeal to the interests to most Russian speakers and most ethnic Russians in the post-Soviet states.
Danguola Bardowskaita, American University. You've mentioned softer means, how European Union should counter Russian propaganda. Could you specify what countries which are in the highest risk, like Estonia, Latvia, what could they do? in regards of softer means? What can they do themselves to protect from possible Russian aggression? Thank you.
Well, in terms of the information warfare and propaganda campaigns, I think it would be a mistake to assume that they're only targeted towards the Russian speakers. There is a huge appetite in the Baltic states and across the post-Soviet space for Russian language media, and specifically this Russian language media is Russian state-controlled. So it's still highly popular. At the same time, you see the Russian media, Russian investors acquiring different medias and different organizations within the different states. So, for example, like the Lithuanian language media or some groups within the Ukrainian language media. So this campaign is much broader. I think, first, being aware and. But second, I think since 2014, there's been an effort to try to create alternative Russian language media, and Estonia and Latvia have started this initiative. There's discussion in the European Union. I think Voice of America, it seems, has been kind of getting more active and more revived. So these are some of the measures. And then beyond propaganda and information warfare, I think it's really about the countries in question. It's really, the task is on them to try to engage their minorities, to try to integrate them fully, and not to leave that space open for the Russian government.
Hi, my name is Dimitri. Thank you very much. Very interesting. My question is about the economic aspect of it. Is there some sort of benefits available to those compatriots in places that are sympathetic to Russia? You mentioned passportization. That could be an economic benefit. And in Crimea, have the people more sympathetic to Russia, have they benefited more since Russia has become in charge of it? Thank you very much.
Are that it's collapsing, the economy is collapsing there. But I think Russia has tried to, like passports. Some people have acquired Russian passports from economic incentives. So if they acquire a Russian passport, it allows them visa-free travel to Russia. They're allowed Russian pensions, minor things of that nature. In certain areas, as I mentioned, for example, in Transnistria, Russian citizens get additional pension, like a bonus each month. I think it used to be something like $50 in 2008, so that added bonus. But I think these are these types of, short-term minimal gains. Overall, South Ossetia, Abkhazia, Transnistria, I mean, these are not places you want to end up in, and this is hardly a model for development. They've become essentially gray zones where there's arms trafficking, drug trafficking, human trafficking, warlords. So this is, again, I think hardly an appealing model.
Our information on these areas is incomplete.
Yes.
But we know, for example, that in Crimea, people who began to receive pensions from Russia received greater pension than they received from Crimea, from Ukraine. But we also know that the overall macroeconomic situation on the peninsula got worse, problems with supplies of various kinds and inflation. We have real information on the increasing oppression of non-Russian groups, of Tatars, of Ukrainian speakers, of non-Moscow patriarchate Christian religions. We also know, moving to Georgia, in the case of Abkhazia, there's been certain improvements along the line of demarcation between Abkhazia and the rest of Georgia, which has, let's say, created at least a little bit of anxiety in the Kremlin and led to certain straightening of circumstances there. On balance, as Agnia says, it's not wonderful to live in any of these areas. Further questions? Right here.
Thank you very much. I'm Nikolai Vorobyov, Ukrainian journalist. So I'm looking the answer on the same simple question, and like for the last 2 years. And I hope to find it in your book. The question, I mean, I have many friends from among Crimean Tatars. I traveled many times to the front lines, and people keep asking me why we gave up Crimea so simply for like just 2 weeks, no reaction on this little green man. So why it was a gift to Russians, including the billions of dollars or millions of dollars of other facilities, tanks, aviations, which are used right now by so-called DNR, LNR against Ukrainian forces. So why authorities in Kyiv, they did not announce state of emergency and all of this stuff? So somebody must be punished for this. Thank you.
Well, I don't know if I can answer all of that, but I think what impacted the turn of events in Crimea was really that a lot of the groundwork had been laid. The conditions were, first of all, what we have to consider, as I discuss in my book, since the 2000s, Russia started actively engaging the Russian speakers there, other minorities, handing out passports, running various compatriot organizations. They also had military on the ground there in the peninsula. At the same time, which is rather unique, is that Russia also employed information warfare and cyber warfare right when when it was launching its military campaign. And it had done the same in Georgia in 2008. So essentially, it was able to somewhat confuse the central government, prevent easy communication between military commanders, Ukrainian military commanders, and the central government. So I think there were elements of that why, to some extent, this was achieved rather seemingly easily.
There's at least one more or two more factors that need to be put into play here. One, of course, you had an interim government in Kyiv at the time of the Russian takeover, not quite sure of itself. And you had the quote-unquote Georgian analogy, such that people in Ukraine, including such normally, I use this word conditionally, aggressive personalities as Yulia Tymoshenko, arguing for caution on the Georgian model. And of course, you had the West arguing in conversations with the Ukrainian leadership at that time, Mr. Turchinov and Mr. Yatsenyuk, for caution. So that goes a long way, I think, to explaining the mild reaction in Ukraine to the Kremlin's aggression. I'll throw one other insight out to you, though. I've been in Ukraine a lot the last 2 years. And on one visit in the fall of 2014, several very high former officials claimed that Ukraine could have and should have stopped the Crimean takeover. And they could have done it if they had sent their prepared special forces, who are in fact ready to go, to take back the parliamentary building in Simferopol when the first little green men appeared. But of course, who knows what the Kremlin reaction to that would have been. It'd be a great what-if article to write.
Yes.
Damian Leader, New York University. In your research, did you find any kind of a systematic link between Russian crime and the Russification efforts outside the borders? Thank you.
I'm not sure about Russification efforts, but there is a link between Russian crime and the frozen conflict zones. I think that's quite clear, and I think that has been studied a bit, and some of those links have been shown. So between particularly, South Ossetia, Abkhazia, Transnistria, particularly some of that trafficking of different types that I discussed. There's some belief and there's some evidence to show that this actually benefits individuals in Russia. they financially benefit from this, and these frozen conflict zones enable even individuals potentially close to the Russian government to money launder in that way using these territories.
Peter Swak, National Defense University. Thank you for your discussion. From your perspective, touching on the factors that you have just covered, the economy, the periphery, the ethnic minorities, the expense, can Russia, from your perspective, looking generationally, continue, if you will, this tempo? Is time working for or against the Russians, and do they know that?
In relation to compatriots and so on. Well, when I examined these issues, I found that it's important not to view them, the compatriot policies and so on, as solely as a kind of a Putinist or Putin's government policy. They have very deep roots. So the efforts to try to ethnically mix populations, to try to bring in, let's say, colonize them and so on, to deport individuals, and kind of use that as an ethnic policy. That goes back to the Russian Tsarist times. It was used in Stalin's ethnic policy. Policies towards compatriots were beginning to be formulated as they currently are under the Yeltsin's regime. I mean, they were kind of incoherent still and maybe not that much acted upon as much as in the Putin's regime. So I view this as something that has deep roots, and I don't see this as something that time is running out in a couple of years, or even if the government changes in Moscow, I still see that as a type of outstanding issue that will remain.
Any other questions? Well, again, thank you for a wonderful discussion, and I thank you all for coming and for your very, very good questions.
Thank you.